From enemies spawned by code crashes to the brother who was completely erased from the game's history, the original Super Mario Bros. Is hiding things that go way beyond the screen. When you boot up Super Mario Bros., the first enemy you stomp on carries a confused identity. In Japan, players face the Kuribo. The name draws from kuri, the Japanese word for chestnut, and bo, a suffix commonly used to denote a child or something small. The visual design tells a different story. Developers modeled the sprite after a shiitake mushroom. They added this enemy at the very end of the production cycle because the team needed a simple, killable threat for the player. The mushroom shape felt fitting for the setting. The American localization took a different path. Nintendo of America chose the name Goomba. This term originates from Italian-American slang. The word Goomba descends from Italian, meaning friend or companion. By the mid-20th century, the term shifted in the United States to describe a street-tough individual. The localization team looked at that scowling, downturned face and decided it fit the image of a scrappy neighborhood tough guy. Look at the horizon in Super Mario Bros. And you see fluffy white clouds. Look at the ground and you see green bushes. You might assume these are two distinct pieces of art, but they are the same object. The developers used the same pixel sprite for both. The cloud and the bush share an identical shape. To differentiate them, the team simply assigned a white color palette to the clouds and a green palette to the bushes. This decision came down to the harsh reality of 8-bit hardware. The original Super Mario Bros. Cartridge had a total capacity of only 40 kilobytes. An impossibly small amount of data by modern standards. Every single byte mattered. Developing two separate assets for background decoration would have wasted valuable memory that the team needed for levels, enemies, and sound effects. Most players assume they have explored every corner of the Mushroom Kingdom, but there is one hidden area that defies the game's own logic. It is called the Minus World, and it exists only because of a breakdown in the NES code. By clipping through a specific wall in the World 1-2 warp zone, you bypass the intended geometry and enter a level that the developers never meant for you to find. When the level indicator pops up on your screen, it displays World -1. The game's internal logic, however, processes this as World 36-1. The system reads the memory address for the world number, finds the value 36, and searches the font table for a character to display. Because the game font has a blank tile at that index, the screen renders a space followed by a 1, creating the visual illusion of a negative world. Once you arrive, you find yourself in an endless underwater loop that mirrors the layout of World 7-2. The pipe at the finish line resets you back to the start and does not send you somewhere else. There is no escape. You eventually run out of time or surrender to a game over. We celebrate birthdays for every major cultural icon, yet the most important game in history lacks a confirmed birth date. Nintendo saved the gaming industry, but they left behind no paper trail for the day Mario first hit American shelves. The confusion stems from the launch of the NES. Nintendo rolled out the console in a limited New York City test market rather than a single, simultaneous nationwide launch. This staggered strategy blurred the timeline. Historians debate dates ranging from October 1985 to as late as March 1986. Nintendo operated as a small venture in the United States during the mid-80s. Record-keeping proved inconsistent, and documentation vanished over the decades. We remain without a verified anniversary for the title that defined a generation. Like and subscribe for more videos about the Red Plumber. It goes a long way. You spend your entire time in the Mushroom Kingdom smashing bricks, but those blocks carry a dark history. Consult the original 1985 Super Mario Bros. Instruction manual and you find a disturbing revelation. The lore explains that King Koopa used black magic to invade the kingdom. He transformed the peaceful inhabitants into inanimate objects, including bricks and mushrooms. This implies that the floating blocks scattered across every stage are actually the captured citizens of the realm. Every time you shatter a brick for a point or a coin, you destroy a toad. The gameplay loop forces you to commit an accidental massacre against the very people you vowed to save. You might know the classic trick. Find a staircase, trap a Koopa Troopa shell against a step, and jump on it repeatedly to farm infinite lives. It feels like a glitch that grants you immortality, but the NES hardware has a ceiling. The game tracks your remaining lives using an 8-bit integer. In binary code, this counter maxes out at 255. Suppose you manipulate the game to collect your 256th life, the game value overflows. The memory address resets and interprets that number as 0. The moment you cross that threshold, your life counter wraps around, registers as nothing, and triggers an immediate game over. You set out to achieve total invincibility, but you end up depleting your progress through sheer technical overreach. The audio engineering in Super Mario Bros. Relies on extreme efficiency. If you listen closely to the sound effect that plays when Mario shrinks after taking damage, you might recognize it from somewhere else. It is the same audio file as the warp pipe travel sound. The developers took the bass pipe travel effect and just played it back at a faster speed to create the power down noise, saving memory. It stands as a brilliant example of how the team squeezed every ounce of utility out of the NES sound chip, repurposing a single sound to serve two entirely different gameplay moments. When you leave Super Mario Bros. Idle on the title screen, a gameplay demonstration begins. You see Mario sprint through World 1-1, jumping obstacles and collecting coins. You might assume this is a pre-recorded video file, but that would consume precious memory the NES could not spare. Instead, the game executes a precise script of controller inputs. The developers stored a compact file of button presses and joystick commands. The engine replays these inputs in real time over the World 1-1 level data. It performs the game exactly as a human player would, demonstrating the mechanics while conserving nearly all its storage capacity. This input playback system allows the game to show off the action without taking up a single kilobyte of video space. Reaching the end of a stage in Super Mario Bros. Often feels like a chaotic scramble. You jump, you slide down the pole, and you wait for the score to tally. But if you see fireworks light up the sky, you just hit a precise calculation. The game checks the final digit of your remaining time the moment you touch the flagpole. It acts as a gatekeeper for your bonus. If that last number is 1, 3, or 6, the game rewards you with the exact number of firework explosions. Each one nets you 500 bonus points. When you encounter these shell-clad enemies, your fire flower becomes useless. The original 1985 manual highlights the Buzzy Beetle as a toughie because its shell resists even direct heat. While Goombas and Koopa Troopers fall to a well-timed fireball, the Buzzy Beetle remains completely unaffected. Bowser stands as the ultimate villain of the Mushroom Kingdom, but before he became the King of Koopas, he carried a much more literal title. Internal documents leaked in 2020 revealed his original development name, Big Tortoise. The design team wasn't looking at a complex villainous moniker at the start. They looked at the character sprite, saw a large turtle, and assigned the most direct description available. You face Bowser at the end of every world, but the King of Koopas plays a trick on you. The creatures guarding the bridges in Worlds 1 through 7 are not the real Bowser. They are minions under a magical disguise. If you reach these boss encounters with a fire flower, the truth becomes clear. A direct hit with a fireball breaks the illusion upon death. Instead of falling as the Koopa King, the enemy reveals its true form: a Goomba, a Buzzy Beetle, or a Spiny. Mario's fireballs share their core graphic with the spinning fire bars found in Bowser's castle. The team took the individual segments of those fire bars, shrunk them, and assigned a fresh color palette. The Super Mushroom and the Goomba share a secret. Align their sprites, and you see the top curve of the mushroom matches the Goomba's head perfectly. The development team reused the same pixel outline to define both shapes. This recycled curve saved storage space and unified the visual style of the game. Bowser appears as a terrifying boss, but his color palette reveals a practical compromise. The NES hardware imposed strict color limits, forcing the team to reuse colors across multiple assets. Bowser's sprite uses the same green and white shades found on a standard Koopa Troopa shell. When you fight him, you face a giant collection of shared color values, a necessary design choice born from the limits of 8-bit technology. You look at Mario riding a dinosaur today, and assume it was part of the plan. In reality, Shigeru Miyamoto wanted Mario to have a dinosaur companion as far back as 1985. The Famicom hardware hit a wall. The console lacked the processing power to manage an extra complex sprite or a mount alongside Mario. The team shelved the concept for years. It required the jump to the 16-bit architecture of the Super Nintendo to finally provide the memory and power to bring Yoshi to life. The first Goomba you meet in World 1-1 almost had a more aggressive start. Original design documents show the enemy perched on top of blocks, ready to drop onto the player's head immediately. The developers worried that a surprise attack seconds into the experience would discourage new players. They needed the opening level to function as a tutorial rather than a gauntlet. Moving the enemy to the flat ground changed the entire dynamic. It gave the player enough space to jump over the threat or choose to stomp it. This decision turned a potential death trap into a safe, controlled lesson in platforming mechanics. Today, game designers build levels with tools that allow for instant adjustments. Dragging a platform or adding a brick takes a single click. When Nintendo created the original Super Mario Bros., they relied on a strictly analog process. Every level started on standard grid graph paper. Shigeru Miyamoto and his team hand-drew these courses, marking each square for blocks, pipes, and enemies. This workflow made iteration a grueling task. If a jump felt off or a playtest revealed a pacing issue, designers could not simply undo their work. They had to manually erase the pencil lines and redraw the entire panel. Once the paper design felt right, the team had to translate those sketches into machine code by hand. When you watch the credits of modern blockbusters, they can take nearly an hour to scroll through, featuring thousands of names. It is staggering to look back at Super Mario Bros. And realize that this global phenomenon, a game that effectively saved the video game industry, was built by a team of just 6 people. Shigeru Miyamoto, the visionary director who treated game design like an art form, obsessing over the feel of Mario's movement above all else. Takeshi Tezuka, the master world builder who turned simple graph paper sketches into the iconic layered levels that define the Mushroom Kingdom. Toshihiko Nakago, the physics architect who wrote the code to make Mario's jumping and running feel fluid, responsive, and satisfying. Kazuaki Morita, the technical magician who performed the impossible feat of squeezing a massive side-scrolling adventure into an incredibly tiny memory footprint. Koji Kondo, the composer who proved that beeps and boops could be music, creating a soundtrack that became a permanent cultural touchstone. Hiroshi Ikeda, the shield who protected the team's creative freedom, ensuring this small, innovative group could work without corporate interference. If you want to talk about the most feared enemies in Super Mario Bros., look no further than the Hammer Bros. While Goombas and Koopas wander in predictable loops, the Hammer Bros were programmed with a much more aggressive logic. They aren't just standing there, they are actively hunting you. Their hammers are thrown in precise arcs designed to intercept your movement, forcing you to constantly rethink your approach. Most players quickly learn to play it safe, hiding behind a block or waiting for a gap in the barrage, but the game actively punishes that patience. If you stall for too long, specifically around 45 to 50 seconds of being on the same screen, the Hammer Bro breaks its defensive pattern entirely. It stops jumping back and forth and begins to charge directly at you. It's a deliberate design choice that enforces the player out of their comfort zone, turning a defensive standoff into a high-speed chase for your life. It wasn't just the code that changed between regions, the experience itself was fundamentally altered for European players. Because the European PAL hardware ran at a slower refresh rate than the North American or Japanese versions, the developers had to make adjustments to keep the game's speed consistent. But some of these changes were surprisingly devious. In the PAL version, bloopers are programmed to sync 4 pixels lower than in the NTSC release, making them significantly harder to dodge in the underwater levels. Even more punishing is the change in World 8-2, where a Koopa paratrooper was physically moved 1 tile over. It wasn't an accident, it was a trap placed specifically to hit players who didn't react with frame-perfect timing. Sometimes, the game's strangest secrets weren't in the code at all, they were in the documentation. The European Spanish instruction manual became legendary for a bizarre printing error. In the manual, the images for Bowser, Princess Toadstool and the jumping board were completely swapped. It created a surreal experience for new players who might have opened their guide to find the main villain labeled as a piece of stage equipment, and the princess depicted as the Koopa King himself. The developers made players play the same level over and over again. Instead of building every single stage from scratch, they relied on remixing previous layouts to challenge the player in new ways. By iterating on established designs, they were able to create a consistent sense of progression while managing the game's limited memory. World 5.4 serves as a perfect example of this philosophy. It shares the same structural foundations as World 2.4, but the designers ramped up the intensity. They added more firebars and swarms of protoboos, transforming a familiar path into a significantly more dangerous gauntlet. You see this technique again in World 7.2 and 7.3. These stages mirror the layouts of Worlds 2.2 and 2.3, but they aren't mere copies. By drastically increasing the enemy density and changing the placement of hazards, the developers forced players to apply the skills they learned earlier in the game to much more difficult scenarios. The cultural impact of Super Mario Bros. Extended far beyond the NES. By 1991, the game's audio had permeated pop culture so deeply that the experimental rock band Mr. Bungle felt compelled to include a nod to it. On their self-titled album, the closing moments of the track Egg feature a distinct sample of the iconic song that plays whenever you clear a level. It's a strange, unexpected touch that perfectly captures how omnipresent the game's sound design had become in the early 90s. The game's aesthetic also took some bizarre turns when it spilled out into the real world. In the late 1980s, the floodgates opened for the officially licensed merchandise, and the quality control was surprisingly consistent. Collectors have since unearthed some truly baffling items from that era. There were products that depicted Mario with a distinctly evil, menacing expression, while Princess Peach was rendered as a small child. It's a jarring contrast to the characters we know today, serving as a relic of the past. The iconic colors of Bowser could be completely shifted because of a glitch. You could turn him blue, actually. He becomes Blue Bowser, and the fans often refer to him as Bowser's brother. In the original Super Mario Bros., this character wasn't part of some grand design plan or a deliberate hidden sibling. He was quite simply the result of a graphical glitch. Due to a palette error or a memory conflict, the game would occasionally render the King of Koopas in a distinct blue hue instead of his standard colors. Instead of being treated as a bug, the color shift captured the imagination of the player base. Players began speculating about who this mysterious double was, and the myth took on a life of its own. It is a perfect example of how a technical mistake can inadvertently expand the lore of a game, eventually gaining enough recognition to appear as a legitimate intentional enemy type in later titles like Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. While some glitches become legendary, others were simply frustrating. In World 2.1, players can encounter a soft lock that feels like a cruel prank by the game's engine. The culprit is the game's strict entity cap. To keep the 8-bit hardware running, the developers had to strictly limit how many enemies and objects could exist on screen simultaneously. If you maneuver too many enemies toward the final pipe, you force the game to hit that maximum limit. When the engine is forced to choose between rendering a threat or a tool, it treats the trampoline as expendable. It simply vanishes from the screen. If you find yourself standing before that pipe without your only way up, there is nothing you can do. You are effectively trapped in the stage, forced to wait helplessly as the timer ticks down to your inevitable game over. For decades, fans have wondered, what is the plumber's last name? Is he just Mario? It turns out his full name might even be more redundant than you ever expected. Thanks to the 1993 Super Mario Bros. Movie and a bit of tongue-in-cheek information from Nintendo over the years, the character's official name is Mario. And consequently, his brother, Luigi Mario. It's the kind of naming quirk that sounds like an urban legend or a joke, yet it does remain one of the most persistent, if slightly baffling, pieces of trivia in the entire franchise. An original Super Mario Bros. NES cartridge weighs at approximately 3.5 ounces. Even after 4 decades, players are still uncovering bizarre quirks in the game's physics engine. World 6.3 hides a particularly surreal glitch involving the game's projectile enemies. If you stomp on a bullet bill at a very precise angle, the game registers an unusual state, leaving the enemy and Mario suspended in midair. The real spectacle, however, happens if you jump on it a second time. The bullet bill begins to descend at an agonizingly slow crawl. During this drift, Mario performs a frantic twitchy animation that makes him look like he is dancing on top of the projectile, and that's how you dance with Mario. The original Super Mario Bros. Is a game that is actually in the Hall of Fame. But for what though? It occupies a pedestal in the real world. The game was one of the inaugural inductees into the World Video Game Hall of Fame at the Strong National Museum of Play. Standing alongside titans like Pong, Pac-Man, Tetris, Doom, and World of Warcraft, Mario is recognized as a defining cultural pillar of the 20th century. Another fascinating quirk that players have stumbled upon over the years involves the red paratrooper. If you manage to stomp a red paratrooper twice while it is still in midair, you trigger a bizarre sequence. The enemy will suddenly freeze, locking in place as if suspended by an invisible string. Beyond frozen Koopas, the game hides even deeper mechanical secrets involving the very memory that holds the world together. There is a bizarre phenomenon where the game's internal logic essentially forgets who an enemy is supposed to be. If you position Mario around the left side of the screen by a tooth at the edge and strike an enemy from below, you can force the game to trigger the enemy to change something completely different. This happens because of how the NES manages memory addresses. This specific spatial placement causes the system to misread the enemy's data point upon impact. It reassigns the enemy's ID. You might find a standard Goomba suddenly transforming into a completely different entity, simply because the game got confused by your exact coordinates. We've already touched on the team's ability to recycle their own work, but sometimes the best ideas come from projects that never actually saw the light of day. Take the iconic moving lift platforms, those precarious ledges that require careful timing to traverse. They weren't originally conceived for a plumber's adventure. Shigeru Miyamoto and the legendary hardware visionary Gunpei Yokoi had previously worked on a game centered around a seesaw mechanic. That project never made it to store shelves, but the developers, instead of discarding the work, salvaged the concept of balance and movement, repurposing those assets into the moving lifts we jump on today. The early development layouts for Super Mario Bros. Explored a surprising amount of visual ambition. In some of the earliest design sketches, the ground was drawn with an angled isometric-like perspective. The developers ultimately scrapped this for the clean side-scrolling 2D view we know today, a necessity to ensure the action felt responsive and clear on the limited hardware at the time. But the dream of that added depth stayed in our hearts. It sat in the background of Nintendo's design philosophy, simmering for nearly a decade. That pursuit of a 3D feeling experience eventually found its true home in the mid-90s with the Donkey Kong Country series. Perhaps the most saddest detail of all concerns the man in green. There is a quiet, overlooked tragedy in the history of the Mushroom Kingdom. Luigi, for all his loyalty, effectively didn't exist in the game's promotional materials. While Mario was immortalized in iconic box art and detailed manual illustrations, Luigi, despite being the indispensable player 2, was left completely behind. There is no official artwork for him from this era. Well, if you loved this video, watch our video on Zelda. It's a banger.